They rarely begin with cruelty. More often they begin with fear, or with a moment someone believes will pass unnoticed. A small concealment, a decision made quietly behind closed doors. And once that decision is made, the silence around it begins to grow like ivy on an old stone wall, slowly, patiently, until the truth beneath it is no longer visible. Children are born into that silence without ever realizing it. They grow beside it. They eat at the same table, sleep beneath the same roof, listen to the same voices, and yet there are questions they somehow never think to ask. Not because they're foolish, but because a household can teach a child, without a single spoken instruction, which subjects are not meant to be touched. For most of my life, I believed the story of my family was as plain as any other in our town. There was hardship, certainly, and loss, as there always was in those years, but nothing that suggested our history had been altered. It was only when I had already lived longer than my own parents ever did that the truth finally came to me. By then, the people who had buried it were gone, and so the weight of it passed to me alone. My name is Abigail Catherine Whitaker. I was born Abigail Catherine Hale on the 17th day of May in the year 1861 in a small farming district just beyond Concord, Massachusetts. And the story I'm about to tell was hidden in my family for more than 70 years. I was born in the spring of 1861 when the country itself seemed to be holding its breath. The newspapers spoke of war almost every week, though in the quiet farming district where we lived, the great movements of armies felt very far away. Our world was smaller. It was measured not in battles or speeches, but in seasons, harvests, and the slow turning of years. My father, Jonathan Hale, was a man of careful habits. He had inherited a modest tract of land from his own father, and he managed it with the sort of steady discipline that rarely draws attention, yet sustains a household for decades. We kept a few dairy cows, a small orchard of apple trees, and fields that yielded more hay than grain. The work was constant but honest, and in those days that was considered enough. My mother, Lydia Hale, was a quieter presence, though no less essential to the life of the house. She was a woman who moved through her duties with a kind of deliberate calm that I did not fully understand as a child. She rose before the sun, tended the kitchen fire, oversaw the baking, the preserving, the mending, and the 1,000 other labors that made a rural household function. I rarely remember her speaking loudly, and yet there was never any confusion about the order of the day. We were not wealthy, but we were not poor either. That distinction mattered greatly in the 19th century. Poverty was something visible and relentless in many towns, and our household managed, by diligence more than fortune, to avoid it. There was always bread, always wood for the stove in winter, and always work enough to justify our place in the community. My earliest memories are not of dramatic events, but of rhythms. The creaking sound of the barn door in the morning wind, the smell of apples drying on racks near the kitchen stove, the long shadows that stretched across the fields in late afternoon when my father returned from the far pasture. Children understand the world first through repetition, and in our house, repetition ruled everything. I was the second of 3 children who survived infancy. My elder brother Samuel was 5 years older than I was, and from the beginning, It was assumed that the land would one day belong to him. Such arrangements were seldom discussed openly, for they were considered natural facts of life, much like the weather or the passage of time. My younger sister, Margaret, was born when I was 6 years old. I remember the winter of her birth clearly, for the snow that year seemed never to end. My mother remained confined to her room for nearly 2 weeks, while an aunt from Boston came to assist with the household. It was the first time I had ever seen the quiet order of our home disturbed by another presence. Looking back now, I believe that winter may also have been the first moment I sensed that our family carried something unspoken. As a child, of course, I did not possess the language to understand such impressions. One notices only fragments, the way certain conversations stop when a child enters a room, or how a particular question is answered too quickly and then never mentioned again. There was, for instance, a small wooden chest that remained at the back of my parents' bedroom closet. It was not locked, but it was never opened in my presence. I knew of its existence only because I once saw my father place something inside it late one evening, while the rest of us believed the day's work had already ended. Children remember such small irregularities long after adults assume they have been forgotten. Our schooling was modest. During the warmer months, when farm labor demanded every available hand, formal lessons were often suspended. But in winter, the district schoolhouse opened again, and we walked the 1.5 miles across frozen fields to attend. The schoolhouse itself was a simple wooden building with a single iron stove in the center. Students of every age shared the same room, reciting lessons aloud while the teacher moved from desk to desk, correcting slates and copybooks. I learned my letters there, along with enough arithmetic to keep accounts and enough scripture to satisfy the expectations of the church. For girls in those days, education was not meant to lead far beyond the home. We were taught reading so that we might study the Bible, writing so that we could maintain household records, and arithmetic only to the extent that it might assist in trade or bookkeeping. No one spoke of ambitions. Respectability was the greater goal. Our church stood at the center of the community both physically and morally. It was a plain white structure with narrow windows and a bell that could be heard across the valley. Every Sunday morning, regardless of weather, families gathered there in their best clothing, the men solemn and the women careful in their composure. Faith in those days was less a matter of private reflection and more a structure that organized life itself. The sermons spoke often of endurance, humility, and the dangers of pride. These were virtues that rural communities valued deeply, for survival itself required a certain acceptance of hardship. My mother seemed especially attentive to such teachings. She listened with a stillness that I once mistook for simple devotion, though now I suspect it may have carried another meaning entirely. There were moments, even during those early years, when I noticed that certain subjects caused a faint tension in the household. It was never an argument. My parents did not quarrel openly, but rather a silence that would descend suddenly and remain until someone deliberately shifted the conversation. One example returns to me with particular clarity. I must have been 9 or 10 years old when a neighbor woman visited one afternoon while my mother and I were preparing preserves in the kitchen. She was speaking about a family who had recently moved into town, describing their origins and relations with great enthusiasm, as people in small communities often do. At some point, she turned to my mother and asked a question that seemed, to my young mind, entirely ordinary. "Remind me again, Lydia," she said. "Your people were from New Hampshire, were they not?" My mother hesitated. It was only a moment, perhaps no more than the space between two breaths, but in a household governed by routine, even such a small pause could feel unusual. "Yes," she answered finally, "New Hampshire." The conversation moved on, and the preserves continued to boil on the stove. No one raised the matter again. Yet I remember my father entering the kitchen not long afterward, standing quietly near the doorway as if listening for something that had already passed. At the time, I thought very little of it. Children rarely question the foundations of their own lives. It would be many years before I understood that some of those foundations had been carefully constructed to hide what lay beneath them. As the years passed, the quiet rhythms of our household continued much as they always had. Childhood, when viewed from the distance of old age, seems to stretch endlessly while one is living through it, yet it vanishes with remarkable speed when remembered later. One season follows another, and before a child has time to examine the shape of her life, she is already standing at the threshold of adulthood. By the time I reached my 12th year, my role within the household had begun to change in ways that were never formally announced. No one sat me down to explain that I was no longer simply a child. The evidence appeared instead in the work expected of me. I rose earlier. I assisted my mother more closely in the kitchen. Tasks that had once been demonstrations slowly became responsibilities. There is a particular education that daughters received in rural households during the 19th century. It was not written in books, nor delivered through lectures, yet it was thorough and unrelenting. A girl learned by watching, by repeating, by correcting mistakes quietly and trying again the next morning. My mother taught me how to knead bread so that it would rise evenly through the long hours of baking. She showed me how to preserve fruit so that it might last through winter without spoiling. I learned to mend torn garments, to wash linens in cold water drawn from the pump, to keep accounts of flour, sugar, and lamp oil in a small ledger that remained on a shelf beside the kitchen door. Each task seemed ordinary on its own, but together they formed the structure of a woman's life. Meanwhile, my brother Samuel was being prepared for another kind of inheritance. My father took him into the fields more often as he grew older. They inspected the fences, discussed the condition of the soil, and planned the rotation of crops with a seriousness that suggested these matters belonged to a world from which my sister and I were naturally excluded. Such divisions were rarely questioned in those days. The arrangement was understood long before anyone had the language to challenge it. Samuel did not appear unkind about this difference. In fact, he remained an affectionate brother during our early years, but I remember noticing how his posture changed when he returned from long days beside my father in the fields. He carried himself with a growing confidence, as though the land itself had begun to recognize him. Margaret, being younger, remained mostly in my company. She followed me through the house as I worked, sometimes assisting, sometimes merely observing with the restless curiosity that younger children possess. I felt toward her something that was not quite authority and not quite companionship, a mixture of both. There were evenings when the four of us gathered around the small wooden table in the kitchen after the day's work had ended. My father would read aloud from the newspaper, describing events that seemed impossibly distant from our quiet valley. The Civil War had begun the year I was born, though its direct presence reached us only through letters, newspapers, and the occasional absence of a neighbor's son who had enlisted. Massachusetts sent many young men south during those years, and the church bell sometimes tolled when news arrived that one of them would not return. I remember one such Sunday distinctly. The entire congregation sat in an unusual silence while the minister read a letter from the War Department confirming the death of a young man named Thomas Ridley. I had seen him only once or twice in passing, yet the sorrow that moved through the church that morning seemed to affect every family equally. After the service, my father spoke very little. Samuel asked questions about the war during our walk home, curious in the way boys often are about distant battles and uniforms. My father answered carefully but without enthusiasm. War, I later realized, was something men discussed with pride when they had not personally seen it. Those who understood its reality rarely spoke of it at length. As the war years passed and the country slowly began to mend itself, life in our town continued with the same deliberate steadiness it had always possessed. Farms changed hands, children grew into adults, and new families arrived to replace those who had moved west in search of greater opportunity. Yet within our own household, there remained a faint undercurrent that I could never quite identify. It was not visible every day. Most mornings began with the familiar sounds of work, the crackling of the kitchen fire, the low voices of my parents discussing the day's tasks, the distant clatter of tools from the barn. But occasionally, without warning, that invisible tension would return. It revealed itself most often in my father. Jonathan Hale was not a man given to displays of temper. His discipline was steady rather than harsh, and he believed strongly in the value of quiet authority. But there were moments when his attention seemed drawn toward thoughts that had little to do with the present. I remember one evening when I found him standing alone in the orchard long after sunset. The trees were little more than dark shapes against the fading sky, and the air carried the coolness that signals the end of summer. I had stepped outside to gather a basket left near the well when I noticed him there, motionless among the rows of apple trees. At first I assumed he was inspecting the branches for signs of disease or damage, as he often did. But he was not examining the trees. He was simply standing still, looking toward the distant road that ran past the far edge of our property. When he realized I had approached, he seemed almost startled. "Abigail," he said after a moment, "you should not wander so far from the house after dark." "I was only fetching the basket," I answered. He nodded, yet remained silent for several seconds before we returned together toward the kitchen door. Even now I can recall the expression on his face in the dim light. It was not fear, but it was not calm either. As I grew older, such moments became easier to notice, though still impossible to explain. There were occasions when letters arrived that my father read privately before placing them into that same wooden chest in his bedroom closet. My mother never asked about them in my presence. Their marriage itself appeared outwardly peaceful. They did not quarrel, and they shared the responsibilities of the farm with quiet efficiency. Yet I sometimes sensed that certain subjects had been carefully removed from their conversations long before I was old enough to hear them. For many years I accepted these small irregularities as part of the natural mystery that surrounds adults in the eyes of children. It did not occur to me that the mystery might belong to my own life. By the time I reached 16, the expectations placed upon me had become unmistakable. My mother began to speak more directly about the future that awaited young women in our town. Marriage was not presented as a romantic possibility, but as a practical transition. A household required a wife. A farm required labor. A community required order. These truths were repeated so often that they eventually came to sound like laws of nature. It was during this same period that my father's watchfulness seemed to increase in subtle ways. He paid closer attention to the visitors who came to our door. He asked more questions about where Samuel had traveled during trips to neighboring towns. Once or twice I even noticed him walking the boundary of our property late in the evening, as though ensuring that something beyond the fields remained at a distance. At the time, I believed he was simply protecting what little we possessed. I did not yet understand that he might also have been guarding something far more fragile than land or livestock, something that had been hidden long before I was born, and something that, whether we realized it or not, was slowly making its way back toward us. The older I grew, the more clearly I began to understand that a household is not merely a place where people live. It is a place where certain truths are permitted to breathe, while others are quietly kept beneath the floorboards of daily life. Children rarely recognize this distinction while they are young. They accept the world presented to them with the trust and simplicity that youth affords. But adolescence has a way of sharpening the senses. By the time I entered my 17th year, I had begun to notice the spaces between words almost as carefully as the words themselves. Our home continued to function with the same steady order it had always known. Morning light spilled across the kitchen table, while my mother prepared bread and porridge. My father and Samuel left for the barn before the sun had fully risen, and Margaret, now nearly 11, moved through the house with the bright restlessness of a girl who had not yet felt the weight of adult expectation. Outwardly nothing had changed, yet inwardly something in me had begun to listen more closely. There were moments, small and fleeting, when the quiet harmony of our household seemed to falter, not in argument, for my parents were not people who raised their voices, but in pauses, silences that stretched just a little longer than comfort allowed. I remember one autumn afternoon in particular. The air carried the sharp fragrance of fallen apples, and the orchard behind our house glowed with that gentle amber light that belongs only to late October. My mother and I were seated near the kitchen window, peeling fruit for preserves, while Margaret recited a passage from her reader aloud. Samuel had ridden into town that morning with a wagon of cider barrels, and my father had remained behind to repair a section of fencing near the southern pasture. For a long time, the only sounds in the room were the steady rhythm of knives against apple skin and Margaret's uncertain voice stumbling through the printed words of her lesson. Then the sound of hooves approached the house. It was not unusual for visitors to arrive unannounced in those days. Our community depended upon one another in ways that modern towns rarely do, and neighbors often stopped by with little ceremony. But when the knock came at the door, my mother's hands became still. It was such a small gesture that Margaret continued reading without interruption. Yet I noticed it immediately, the way the knife remained suspended in my mother's hand for a brief second before she placed it quietly upon the table. "I will see who it is," she said. Her voice was calm, perhaps even calm enough to convince someone who had not been watching closely. From where I sat, I could see only the edge of the doorway as she opened it. The figure outside remained hidden from my view, though I heard the low murmur of voices as the two of them exchanged a few brief words. Then the door closed again. My mother returned to the table and resumed peeling the apple before her. "Who was it?" I asked. "A man asking directions," she replied. "He has taken the wrong road somewhere along the valley." The explanation was simple, and yet something about it did not sit easily within me. Perhaps it was the fact that travelers rarely asked directions at isolated farmhouses unless they had already lost their way badly. Or perhaps it was the way my mother avoided my eyes as she spoke. I did not question her further. But later that evening, when my father returned from the pasture, I noticed the two of them speaking together in the far corner of the kitchen with their voices lowered. Their conversation ended abruptly when Samuel entered the room. For many years afterward, I would remember that moment with an odd clarity, not because I understood it then, but because I sensed instinctively that something in our home had shifted. Life, however, does not pause simply because unease has entered the room. Winter followed autumn as it always did. Snow gathered along the fences, the orchard fell silent beneath frost, and our days became centered almost entirely within the warmth of the kitchen. Those were the months when stories were sometimes told. Not grand tales of heroism or adventure, but the quieter narratives of family history, who had married whom, which ancestors had traveled from distant states, which branches of the family tree had prospered, and which had faded into obscurity. Such conversations often took place after supper, when the lamps were lit and the cold outside made the house feel like a small island of warmth. It was during one of those evenings that I first heard a story which would remain in my thoughts for many years. My father was describing his own childhood in New Hampshire, speaking of the long winters and the narrow mountain roads where snow sometimes rose higher than the carriage wheels. Samuel listened with polite interest while Margaret leaned against my shoulder, already half asleep. At some point, I asked a question that seemed entirely innocent. "Did Mother grow up there as well?" My father's voice stopped, only for a second. Then he answered, "No, your mother came from farther south." The reply felt incomplete. "Where exactly?" I asked. Before my father could respond, my mother spoke from the stove. "New Hampshire was only where your father lived as a boy," she said gently. "My own family moved several times when I was young. There is little sense in remembering each place." Her tone was neither sharp nor defensive. yet it carried a quiet finality that discouraged further inquiry. The conversation moved on. Samuel began speaking about a horse he hoped to purchase the following spring, and the evening settled back into its usual calm. But that night, lying awake beneath the heavy quilts in the small room Margaret and I shared, I found myself wondering about something I had never considered before. Most families in our town seemed to know their own histories with remarkable precision. They spoke easily of grandparents and great-grandparents, of farms that had passed through generations, of marriages that connected one household to another across the valley. Our own family history, by contrast, always seemed to begin with my parents. Beyond them, the past grew strangely indistinct. At 17, I could not yet name the feeling that stirred within me, but it was the first moment I began to suspect that our family story, the one I had always accepted without question, might contain chapters that had never been read aloud. And once a person begins to notice such absences, they become very difficult to forget. It is a curious thing how the mind preserves certain years with unusual clarity, while others fade into a blur of routine and passing seasons. My 18th year remains fixed in my memory with a quiet sharpness, as though something within me had already begun preparing for the change that was slowly approaching our household. Up to that point, my life had followed the familiar pattern expected of a young woman in our town. My duties had grown steadily heavier with each passing year, though they never felt burdensome in the way outsiders might imagine. Work, after all, was the structure around which our days were organized. Without it, time itself seemed uncertain. I rose before dawn to assist my mother with the morning fire. The stove required careful attention during the colder months, and the kitchen could not function until the iron plates had warmed enough to accept the first kettle of water. Bread dough was prepared early, sometimes before the first light reached the eastern fields. On washing days, we carried heavy buckets to the pump behind the house, our hands numbing quickly in the cold water as linens were scrubbed and wrung dry. These routines had become so natural to me that I rarely paused to question them. They were simply the shape of life as I understood it. Yet even within such predictability, small disturbances occasionally appeared. My father had grown more watchful during those years. It was not a change that could be easily described, but rather a gradual tightening of his attention toward matters that once passed without remark. When travelers rode along the distant road, he sometimes paused in his work to observe them longer than necessary. If a stranger approached the house, my father seemed to take careful note of his appearance, his manner of speaking, and even the direction from which he had come. Samuel noticed this as well, though he interpreted it differently. "Father worries too much," he said one evening while we were repairing harness straps in the barn. "A man might think we were guarding a bank vault instead of a few acres of hay." He spoke lightly, yet I sensed beneath his words the impatience of a young man eager to prove himself independent. Samuel was 23 by then, strong and confident in the quiet way that comes from years of physical labor. He had begun speaking occasionally of expanding the farm, perhaps acquiring additional land farther along the valley where the soil was said to be richer. My father listened to these ideas with polite attention, but seldom offered encouragement. Land should be managed carefully before it is increased, he would say. At the time, I believed their differences were merely the ordinary disagreements that arise between generations. It never occurred to me that my father's caution might have deeper roots. My mother, meanwhile, continued to move through the household with the same quiet steadiness she had always possessed. Yet I had begun to notice a certain fatigue in her manner, especially during the long winter months when daylight was scarce and the demands of the house seemed endless. She was not yet an old woman, perhaps only in her early 40s, but life in those years could age a person quickly. There were evenings when she sat longer than usual beside the stove after supper had ended, her hands resting in her lap as though gathering strength before the next task. On one such evening I found her alone in the kitchen, while the others were still finishing their work outside. The lamps had not yet been lit, and the room was filled with that soft gray light that lingers between sunset and darkness. For a moment, she did not notice me standing in the doorway. She was looking toward the small wooden chest that stood against the wall near my parents' bedroom. It was the same chest I had glimpsed years earlier, the one my father sometimes opened late at night when he believed the rest of us asleep. My mother rose quickly when she realized I was there. "Abigail," she said gently, "would you bring the lamp from the pantry? It grows dark sooner each evening now." Her voice was calm, yet the faint tension I had come to recognize passed through the room once again. I obeyed without question. But as I returned with the lamp, I noticed that the lid of the chest had been closed firmly, as though whatever lay inside it had once again been placed beyond sight. Moments like these accumulated quietly over the years. Each one seemed insignificant on its own, yet together they formed a pattern that I could feel more clearly than I could explain. The following spring brought changes that altered the rhythm of our household more visibly. Samuel had begun courting a young woman named Rebecca Lowell, whose family owned a small farm 2 miles north of our property. She was a gentle, thoughtful girl with steady blue eyes and a manner that suggested she had been raised with careful discipline. Her visits to our home were modest at first. Brief afternoons spent assisting my mother in the kitchen or walking through the orchard with Margaret while Samuel and my father discussed farm matters nearby. Gradually, those visits became more frequent. Courtship in our community was rarely dramatic. It unfolded slowly, guided by the quiet approval of families rather than the impulses of youth. Yet even this ordinary development seemed to bring an unexpected unease to my father. One evening after Rebecca had returned home, I overheard my parents speaking softly in the front room. "She is a respectable girl," my mother was saying. "I do not doubt it," my father replied. "Then why do you hesitate?" There was a pause. "I hesitate," he said finally, "because marriage brings attention. Families ask questions. Histories are compared." My mother did not answer immediately. When she did, her voice carried a note of weary patience. "Jonathan," she said, "those matters belong to the past." "The past has a way of returning," he replied quietly. I remained very still in the hallway outside the room, scarcely daring to breathe. Their conversation ended soon afterward, but the words remained with me long into the night. Until that moment, I'd only sensed the presence of some hidden strain within our family. Now, for the first time, I began to suspect that whatever had been buried in the past might not have disappeared as completely as my parents had hoped, and though I did not yet understand the nature of that buried truth, I felt increasingly certain that its shadow was growing longer with every passing year. The summer that followed Samuel's courtship unfolded with a peculiar mixture of ordinary happiness and quiet apprehension. From the outside, our household must have appeared much like any other farmstead in the valley. The orchards were heavy with fruit, the hayfields stood tall beneath the sun, and the familiar rhythm of work carried us steadily from one week to the next. Yet beneath that calm surface, something within our home had begun to shift. Samuel's visits to the Lowell farm grew more frequent, and Rebecca's presence among us slowly became a regular part of our days. She possessed a manner that blended gentleness with a certain practical intelligence, the sort of disposition that farm life demands in a woman. My mother seemed to approve of her quietly, observing the girl's habits in the kitchen and the care with which she approached even the smallest task. Margaret adored her almost immediately. I too found Rebecca easy to like. She did not speak excessively, nor did she attempt to place herself at the center of attention. Instead, she listened carefully, asked thoughtful questions, and worked alongside us without hesitation whenever she visited. In many respects, she seemed precisely the kind of woman who might bring steadiness to Samuel's future. And yet my father remained uneasy. He never spoke against the match openly. That would have been unlike him, for he was a man who believed that objections should be offered only when one was prepared to explain them fully. Instead, his concern revealed itself in smaller ways. He asked Samuel questions about Rebecca's family that seemed unusually thorough. "How long have the Lowells held that farm?" he would ask. "Do they have relatives in other towns? Where was her father born?" Samuel answered these inquiries with patience at first, assuming they were simply the practical considerations of a father evaluating his son's future. But over time, even he began to notice the unusual persistence of these questions. One evening after Rebecca had returned home and the rest of us were preparing for bed, Samuel spoke about it with a hint of frustration. "I cannot understand why Father examines every branch of that family tree as though he were searching for a missing piece," he said. My mother, who was folding linens at the table, paused only briefly before answering. "Your father has lived long enough to know that families carry more history than they sometimes reveal." Samuel shrugged. "All families have history," he replied. "That does not mean it concerns us." My mother did not respond. Looking back now, I believe she already understood far more about the matter than any of us realized. As summer progressed, preparations for the harvest demanded nearly every hour of daylight. The fields required constant attention, and even Margaret had begun assisting with small tasks in the orchard. Work has a curious ability to dull the mind's attention to deeper worries. When one spends an entire day lifting crates, tending animals, and managing tools beneath the sun, there's little energy left for speculation. Yet the tension within our household never quite disappeared. It appeared most clearly in my father's habits during the late evening hours. More than once I noticed him stepping outside after supper had ended, walking slowly toward the edge of the property, where the narrow road passed beyond the fields. Sometimes he remained there for several minutes, watching the empty stretch of dirt and stone as though expecting someone to appear. When he returned to the house, he said nothing. At the time, I interpreted this behavior as the simple caution of a man responsible for protecting his land and family. But even then, a quiet question had begun forming in my mind. What exactly did my father believe might arrive on that road? The answer did not come immediately. Instead, it arrived in the form of an unexpected visitor. It was late September of that year, a mild afternoon when the air carried the first faint promise of autumn. My mother and I were in the kitchen sorting apples that had been gathered from the orchard earlier that morning. Margaret had taken a basket of smaller fruit to the cellar for storage, and the house was unusually quiet. Then came the sound of a carriage. Unlike the occasional rider who passed along the distant road, this carriage turned directly into the narrow path leading toward our house. I remember wiping my hands on my apron and stepping toward the window. A single horse drew the carriage slowly across the yard. The driver was an older man, perhaps in his late 50s, with a narrow face and the sort of careful posture one associates with clerks or teachers rather than farmers. My father emerged from the barn almost immediately. The two men regarded one another for several seconds before exchanging a few quiet words that I could not hear from the house. Something about their meeting unsettled me instantly. It was not hostility. Neither man raised his voice, but there was a certain tension in the way they stood facing each other. My mother had also come to the window by then. I saw her expression change the moment she recognized the visitor. She did not gasp or speak, but the color drained from her face so suddenly that I felt a chill run through me. "Mother," I whispered, "do you know him?" For a long moment she did not answer. Then she said quietly, "Yes," nothing more. Outside, my father gestured toward the house, inviting the man inside. The visitor removed his hat politely before stepping through the door. Up close, he appeared tired from travel, though his clothing suggested a respectable profession. His coat was dark and well kept, and he carried a small leather case that might easily have belonged to a lawyer or a man accustomed to managing documents. "Good afternoon," he said courteously. His voice was calm, almost gentle. My father introduced him simply as Mr. Caldwell. No explanation followed. The man's eyes moved slowly around the room before settling briefly upon my mother. In that moment, I saw something pass between them. Not recognition exactly, but something far heavier. Something that belonged to years long before my own memory began. Mr. Caldwell remained with us for nearly an hour. Most of that time he spent speaking privately with my father in the front room, while the rest of us continued our work in uneasy silence. Through the thin walls of the house, I occasionally heard fragments of their conversation, words such as records, documents, and once, unmistakably, the word name. When the visitor finally departed, the house seemed strangely hollow. My father stood for several minutes beside the table after the door had closed. No one spoke. Then my mother asked a question, in a voice so quiet that it was almost a breath. "What did he want?" My father looked at her with an expression I had never seen before. "Confirmation," he said. "Of what?" He hesitated. Then he answered with 3 words that would remain in my mind for the rest of my life. Of who Abigail is. For a moment after my father spoke those words, the room seemed to lose all movement. The air itself felt suspended, as though the house had drawn a breath it did not know how to release. Of who Abigail is. I remember standing very still beside the kitchen table, my hands resting against the wood, trying to understand what those words could possibly mean. My name had been spoken so plainly, and yet the meaning behind it seemed to belong to a conversation that had begun long before I was born. Margaret looked from one face to another, her young expression filled with confusion. Samuel, who had entered the house only moments earlier from the barn, frowned slightly. "What does that mean?" he asked. My father did not answer immediately. Instead, he walked slowly to the chair beside the stove and sat down in the same deliberate manner he used when considering matters of great importance. He removed his hat, placed it carefully upon the table, and rested his hands upon his knees. It was a posture I had seen many times before, the posture of a man preparing himself to speak plainly. Yet the words did not come. My mother remained standing near the window, her fingers gripping the back of a wooden chair, as though the strength of the furniture might somehow steady her. I had never seen her look so pale. At length my father raised his eyes toward me. "Abigail," he said quietly, "how much do you know about your mother's family?" The question struck me as strange. "Very little," I admitted, "only that they lived farther south before coming here." My father nodded slowly, as though this answer confirmed something he had already expected. "That is because much of that history was left unexplained." Samuel shifted his weight impatiently. "Father, what is all this about? Who was that man?" "His name is Edward Caldwell," my father replied. "He is a solicitor who has been examining certain records in Boston." "Records of what?" For a moment my father seemed to search for the correct words. "Family records," he said at last. No one spoke. The quiet that followed felt heavier than any silence our household had ever known. My father turned his gaze toward my mother. "Lydia," he said gently, "perhaps it is time." She closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them again, the calm composure that had governed her entire life appeared to have settled over her once more, though I could see the effort it required. "I had hoped," she said softly, "that the matter would never return." "It has returned," my father answered. She nodded once, then she looked at me. There are moments in a person's life when the world seems to tilt slightly, revealing that the ground beneath one's feet is not as solid as it once appeared. I believe I felt the first hint of that sensation as my mother began to speak. "You have always believed," she said, "that I came from a modest farming family in New Hampshire." "Yes," I answered. That was not entirely true. The words were simple, yet they seemed to open a door that had remained closed for decades. "My parents did live in New Hampshire for a time," she continued, "but it was not where I was born." Samuel leaned forward slightly. "Where were you born, Mother?" "In Pennsylvania." That revelation alone might have seemed minor under ordinary circumstances. Families moved often in those years, especially as the country expanded westward. But the way she spoke the name of that place carried a gravity that suggested far more lay behind it. "My father," she said carefully, was once connected to a family of considerable standing in that state. They owned land, businesses, and held influence within the community. Samuel raised his eyebrows. You never mentioned that before. No, she replied, and I did not. Why not? For a long moment she did not answer. Instead, she walked slowly toward the small wooden chest that stood against the wall, the same chest that had remained closed for as long as I could remember. My father watched her in silence as she knelt before it and lifted the lid. Inside were several bundles of papers tied with faded ribbon, along with a few small objects wrapped carefully in cloth. She removed one of the bundles and held it in her hands for a moment before turning back toward us. These documents, she said quietly, contain the names that once belonged to my family. Samuel laughed softly in disbelief. Names? Mother, everyone has names. Yes, she said, but not everyone must spend a lifetime hiding them. The room fell silent again. I felt my heart beating more quickly now, though I could not have explained why. My mother untied the ribbon and unfolded one of the yellowed sheets of paper. Even from where I stood, I could see that the writing upon it was formal, the sort of careful script used in legal records. Edward Caldwell has been searching for these, she said. Why? Samuel asked. Because the family I once belonged to has begun tracing its surviving heirs. Samuel frowned. And what does that have to do with us? My mother's eyes moved slowly toward me. Everything seemed to narrow in that moment. The room, the voices, even the light coming through the window. Because, she said gently, according to those records, Abigail may be one of them. The words did not register immediately. I remember hearing them, yet understanding arrived several seconds later, like the distant echo of a sound. One of what? I asked. One of the surviving heirs. Samuel stood up abruptly. That makes no sense, he said. Abigail is your daughter. Yes, my mother replied. But the family whose records missed her. Caldwell has been studying, believes that a child disappeared from their household many years ago. My father's voice was very quiet when he spoke. And they now suspect, he said, that the child may have been brought here. My thoughts seemed to scatter in every direction at once. You mean, I began, though the sentence refused to finish itself. My mother stepped closer. Her expression held both sorrow and a strange kind of relief. It means, she said softly, that the story of your birth may not be the one you have always been told. I felt the strength leave my legs so suddenly that I had to grasp the edge of the table to steady myself. For 18 years I had believed my life to be simple, even ordinary. In that single moment, the foundation of that belief began to crumble, and though none of us yet understood the full truth of what had happened, I sensed that the quiet secret my family had carried for so long had finally begun to reveal itself, whether we were ready to face it or not. I remember very clearly the silence that followed my mother's words. It was not the ordinary quiet of a household pausing between tasks, but a deeper stillness, the kind that settles when something long hidden has begun to surface, and no one yet knows how far the truth may reach. For 18 years I had lived within a story that seemed perfectly ordinary. I was the daughter of Jonathan and Lydia Hale. I had been born in the spring of 1861, raised on the same land that surrounded us still, and taught the same lessons of patience and work that shaped the lives of countless other farm daughters across Massachusetts. Now, in a single evening, that story had begun to unravel. Samuel was the first to recover his voice. "This cannot be serious," he said, though there was no laughter in his tone. "Surely there has been some mistake in those records." My father did not answer him immediately. Instead, he looked toward my mother, as though granting her the right to continue what she had begun. She remained standing beside the table, the fragile document still resting in her hands. "There may indeed be mistakes," she said quietly. "Records are written by men, and men often misunderstand the things they believe they know." "Then why would this solicitor come all the way here?" Samuel asked. "Because certain details have begun to align in ways that cannot easily be ignored." My brother paced slowly across the room, the wooden floor creaking beneath his boots. "And what exactly are those details?" My mother hesitated. I could see that she was choosing her words carefully, measuring each sentence before allowing it to leave her lips. "The family Mr. Caldwell represents once had a daughter who disappeared under circumstances that were never fully explained." Margaret, who had remained silent until that moment, spoke in a small, uncertain voice. "You mean she ran away?" "No," my mother replied gently. "She was an infant." The room seemed to shrink around us. "An infant?" Samuel repeated. "Yes. How could an infant simply disappear?" My father answered this time. "There was illness in the household," he said. "Several members of the family fell sick during the same winter. In the confusion that followed, the child was believed to have died." "Believed?" Samuel said sharply. "The body was never properly identified." Samuel stopped pacing. "You are suggesting that this family thinks their child survived, and that Abigail might be that child?" My mother lowered her eyes briefly before answering. "That is what the solicitor has come to determine." The words seemed almost impossible to absorb. I felt as though I were listening to a conversation that concerned someone else entirely, a stranger whose life had somehow been mistaken for my own. "But that cannot be true," I said quietly. All three of them looked toward me. "My birth. You told me the date. You told me where I was born." "Yes," my mother said, "and that was not a lie." Her answer startled me. "If it was not a lie," I asked, "then what is it?" My father spoke with a heaviness I had never heard in his voice before. It was the truth as we chose to present it. Samuel shook his head. "This is madness." My mother moved slowly toward the window, gazing out across the darkening yard where the last light of evening had begun to fade. "When you were born," she said quietly, "the world beyond our home was already filled with grief. The war had begun. Families were losing sons every month. Disease passed through towns with little warning." She paused. "And in another household, not so very far from here, a woman believed she had lost her child." The room remained perfectly still. "You knew this woman?" Samuel asked. "Yes." "Who was she?" My mother did not turn from the window as she answered. "She was my sister." Those words struck the room like a sudden wind. Samuel stared at her in disbelief. "You had a sister?" I had several. You never mentioned them. No? Why? My mother's shoulders rose slightly as she drew a long breath. Because after that winter, I no longer belonged to that family. My father stood and moved beside her. Lydia, he said softly, you do not need to tell everything tonight. Yes, she replied, I do. She turned back toward us, her expression both weary and resolute. The child who disappeared from my sister's household was not taken by strangers, nor lost through accident. Samuel's voice was barely more than a whisper now. Then what happened to her? My mother looked directly at me. I took her. The words seemed to echo in my mind long after they had been spoken. For several seconds, I could not even breathe. You took her? Samuel said. Yes, but why? My mother's eyes filled with a sorrow I had never seen before. Because my sister was dying. The explanation came slowly, as though each memory carried its own weight. She had fallen ill during the winter. The doctors said her lungs were failing, though they did not understand why. Her husband had already been taken by fever the year before. The household was collapsing around her. And the child? Samuel asked. She was barely 6 weeks old. My mother's voice trembled slightly now. My sister believed the child would not survive the coming months if she remained in that house. There was too much sickness, too much confusion. So she gave the baby to you? Samuel asked. Yes. And that baby was Abigail? My mother nodded. The room seemed to tilt again, the familiar shapes of the kitchen suddenly strange to my eyes. But why tell everyone the child had died? Samuel said. Because that was the only way to protect her. Protect her from what? My father answered this time. From the claims that would have followed. Samuel frowned. What claims? The child's inheritance. The word hung heavily in the air. My mother continued softly. My sister feared that certain relatives would attempt to control the estate if the child remained publicly recognized as its heir. So the child was declared dead, Samuel said slowly. Yes. And you brought her here. My mother looked at me again. I brought you here. The truth settled over the room with a quiet finality. For 18 years I had believed I understood who I was. Now I stood between two histories, the life I had lived and the life that might have belonged to me. Had that winter unfolded differently? Does Mr. Caldwell know all this? Samuel asked. Not yet, my father said. Then what does he know? He knows that records exist which suggest the missing child may have survived. Samuel looked from my father to my mother, and now he suspects that child is Abigail. Yes. Another long silence followed. Finally, Samuel spoke again. And what happens now? My father answered quietly. Now, the past decides whether it intends to remain buried. The house felt different after that night, though nothing within its walls had physically changed. The same table stood in the kitchen. The same lamps were lit at dusk. The same fields stretched beyond the windows, touched each morning by the pale light of early sun. And yet I no longer moved through those spaces with the certainty I once possessed. It is difficult to describe what occurs inside the mind when the foundation of one's identity begins to shift. A person does not immediately become someone else. The habits of a lifetime do not vanish in a single evening. I still rose at dawn, still carried water from the pump, still assisted my mother with the ordinary work of the household. But beneath every movement there was a question that had not existed before. Who had I been all those years? And perhaps more unsettling still, who had I not been allowed to be? For several days after Mr. Caldwell's visit, the subject remained largely unspoken. My parents continued their routines with a kind of deliberate calm, as though they believed that by preserving the familiar order of the house, they might prevent the situation from unfolding further. Samuel returned to his work in the fields, though I noticed that he watched our father more carefully than he once had. Margaret, being young, understood only fragments of what had occurred. She sensed the tension that lingered in the rooms, but could not grasp its cause. As for myself, I moved through those days in a state of quiet observation. Every small detail of my childhood seemed to return to my thoughts with new meaning. The wooden chest in my parents' bedroom, the letters my father had read in private, the uneasy way certain questions had always been answered. What had once appeared to be simple irregularities now formed the outline of something much larger. 3 days after the revelation in our kitchen, Mr. Caldwell returned. I remember the morning clearly. A thin mist hung low across the fields, and the sound of the carriage wheels reached the house before the vehicle itself became visible through the trees. My father was already standing near the barn when the visitor arrived, as though he had expected him. This time there was no hesitation at the door. Mr. Caldwell entered the house with the same polite composure he had shown during his first visit, though I noticed that his eyes lingered on me more deliberately now. "Miss Hale," he said with a slight inclination of his head. His voice carried the calm authority of a man accustomed to examining difficult matters without allowing his own emotions to interfere. "Mr. Caldwell," my father replied. We gathered again in the kitchen, though the atmosphere felt more formal than it had before. The visitor placed his leather case upon the table and opened it carefully, removing several documents bound together with thin cord. "I believe," he began, "that certain explanations may now be necessary." My father nodded. "Yes." Mr. Caldwell turned slightly toward my mother. "Mrs. Hale," he said, "your husband has informed me that you may possess information relevant to the inquiry I have been conducting." My mother remained composed, though I could see the quiet strain behind her expression. "I possess memories," she said. "That may be sufficient." The solicitor unfolded a sheet of paper and placed it upon the table between us. "This," he explained, "is a record from the county registry in Pennsylvania dated February of 1861. It concerns the birth of a child to the household of Jonathan Whitaker and his wife, Eleanor Whitaker. The name struck me immediately, Whitaker. It sounded unfamiliar and yet strangely important at the same time. The child," Mr. Caldwell continued, "was a daughter." He paused before speaking the next words. "Her name was recorded as Abigail Catherine Whitaker." The room grew perfectly still. I heard my own breath catch in my throat. "That child, Mr." Caldwell said gently, "was believed to have died 6 weeks later during a severe illness that affected several members of the household." He lifted his eyes toward my mother. "Yet the circumstances surrounding that death were never fully documented." My father spoke quietly. "Because the child did not die." Mr. Caldwell inclined his head. That possibility has become increasingly difficult to dismiss. He produced another document from the case. This record, he said, comes from a church registry in Massachusetts dated May of the same year. He placed it beside the first. It records the baptism of a child named Abigail Catherine Hale. My heart began to beat more rapidly. The dates written upon the 2 pages were separated by only a few months. Mr. Caldwell looked directly at me. The coincidence of those names and dates would already be unusual, he said. But further inquiries have revealed that Mrs. Hale traveled briefly to Pennsylvania during the winter preceding that baptism. My mother did not attempt to deny it. Yes, she said quietly. I did. And you returned with the child? Yes. Mr. Caldwell folded his hands together. In other words, he said carefully, the child who was declared deceased in Pennsylvania may in fact have been raised here under another name. Samuel exhaled slowly. You mean Abigail was never Abigail Hale at all? The solicitor turned his gaze toward me once more. She may have been Abigail Whitaker from the moment she first entered the world. The name felt strange upon my ears. Whitaker. It belonged to a life I had never known. Mr. Caldwell closed the leather case gently. I have not come here to cause distress, he said. My duty is simply to establish the truth of the matter. What happens if that truth is confirmed? Samuel asked. The solicitor hesitated. The Whitaker estate in Pennsylvania was never fully settled. If their daughter survived, she remains the legal heir to certain properties and financial holdings. Samuel let out a soft whistle. You mean Abigail could inherit all of that? Yes. The word hung in the air. For the first time since the conversation began, I found my voice. And if I do not wish to claim it? I asked. All 3 men looked at me with mild surprise. Mr. Caldwell spoke gently. That decision would ultimately be yours. I glanced toward my parents, the people who had raised me, the people whose quiet choices had shaped every year of my life. In that moment, the inheritance being discussed felt strangely distant, because the truth that mattered most had already become clear. I had not lost my past. I had discovered that I possessed 2 of them, and neither one could easily be abandoned. In the weeks that followed Mr. Caldwell's second visit, the house settled once again into its familiar rhythms. The fields still demanded attention, the orchard still needed tending, and the seasons, as they always had, continued their quiet and indifferent passage across the land. Yet within me, something had changed that no season could reverse. It is strange how calmly the mind eventually receives truth that once seemed impossible to bear. In the days immediately after the solicitor revealed the records from Pennsylvania, I believed my life had been divided into 2 separate histories, the one I had lived and the one that had been hidden from me. But time, which has a way of softening even the most unsettling revelations, slowly taught me something different. A life is not replaced by the discovery of another. It is enlarged. Mr. Caldwell remained in correspondence with our family for several months after that autumn. Letters arrived occasionally bearing his careful handwriting, each one containing small fragments of information gathered from distant records and fading registries. With each letter, the outline of the story grew clearer. My mother's sister, the woman who had given birth to me, had indeed died shortly after the winter of my birth. The household she left behind had been fractured by illness, debt, and disputes among relatives who cared more for land than for the fragile life of a newborn child. My mother, still young at the time, had done what she believed was the only merciful thing available to her. She had taken me, not as a thief, but as a guardian. In the eyes of the law, the act may have appeared questionable, yet in the quiet language of family, sacrifice often takes forms that official records cannot fully explain. When I was first told of the inheritance that might belong to the Whitaker name, many people assumed that such news would bring excitement. Land in Pennsylvania, financial holdings left unsettled for nearly 2 decades. These were matters that could easily change the course of a young person's life. But the truth is that I felt very little temptation toward that world. By the time those letters arrived, my own life had already taken shape within the soil of Massachusetts. Samuel had married Rebecca the following spring. Margaret continued her schooling for several years before eventually establishing a household of her own. My parents grew older, though their quiet strength remained visible in the way they moved through the rooms of the house they had built together. And I remained where I had always been. The Whitaker estate was eventually settled through legal arrangements that allowed certain properties to pass through distant relatives while preserving a modest portion for my name. Mr. Caldwell handled those matters with the same careful attention he had shown from the beginning, yet the inheritance itself never altered the central truth of my life. I was raised as Abigail Hale. I learned patience from Jonathan Hale. I learned endurance from Lydia Hale. The blood that had carried my name into the world belonged to another family, yes, but the hands that shaped my character belonged to the 2 people who had chosen to raise me when the world believed I no longer existed. Years passed, decades in fact. My parents eventually left this world with the same quiet dignity that had defined their lives. Samuel and Margaret built families of their own, and the farm itself passed into new hands as generations changed. The documents Mr. Caldwell once carried eventually came to rest in my possession. They remain with me even now, their paper softened by age, their ink faded but still legible to a careful eye. Sometimes visitors who learn my story ask a question that seems very important to them. They ask whether I resent the secret that surrounded my childhood, whether I feel that something was stolen from me by the choice my mother made so many years ago. At 93 years of age, I find that such questions no longer trouble me. The truth is simpler than most people expect. I was never deprived of a life. I was given one. The woman who carried me into the world did not live long enough to see me grow, but the woman who brought me into this house watched every year of my childhood unfold beneath her roof. If there was deception in that choice, it was not born of selfishness. It was born of protection. And perhaps that is why the secret remained buried for 70 years. Not because it was shameful, but because it belonged to a generation that believed love was sometimes best expressed through silence. Now I sit near the end of my own years, the fields of my childhood long since changed. The people who once filled this house existing only in memory. And when I look back across the long path of my life, I do not see two histories struggling against one another. I see a single story, a child who was once declared lost, and a family who quietly refused to let that loss become real. My name, as the world first recorded it, was Abigail Catherine Whitaker, but the life I lived, the one that shaped the woman speaking to you now, was the life of Abigail Catherine Hale. And after 93 years, I've come to believe that both names were always mine.